Good morning, students. Welcome to SST So Simple tutorial. I hope that you all have attended all the classes of the End of Bipolarity and now you have a fair understanding of the topic. Today I am going for a one-shot revision of the same lesson, the End of Bipolarity, so that it is helpful to you to quickly revise the lesson. So let us start. What was the Soviet system? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics (USSR), my dear students, came into being after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 in Russia. What inspired this revolution? Which ideology inspired this revolution? This revolution was inspired by the ideals of socialism, which was basically opposed to the idea of capitalism. In socialism, means of production and distribution are owned and operated by the state, whereas in capitalism, they are owned and controlled by private parties. This idea was also driven by the need to create an egalitarian society. Egalitarian society means a society that supports or follows the idea that all people are equal and should have the same rights and opportunities. So, this was perhaps the biggest attempt in human history to abolish the institution of private property and consciously design a society which was based on principles of equality. Okay. Let us now see the features of the Soviet system. My dear students, the makers of the Soviet system gave importance to two things. First, the state, and second, the party. On one hand, their political system centered around the Communist Party, and no other political party was allowed. Basically, they did not want any ideology that is different from communism to come up in the country. On the other hand, the economy was planned and controlled by the state. After the Second World War, the East European states like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, who came under the control of Soviet Union, also followed the same political and economic system as that of the USSR. So what I was talking last, the Soviet economy, it was planned, it was controlled by state. In planned economy, what happens is that only the state decides what goods should be produced, how and on what scale. Be it the production of ordinary things of daily use or heavy machinery, every decision was taken by the state. Then they started 5 years plans. As a result of this, their industries grew, their economy grew, poverty started to disappear. After the Second World War, we have read that the Soviet Union had emerged as a great power. At that time, their economy, except for the US, was much more developed than the rest of the world. Soviet Russia had a good and improved complex communications network. Russia had vast energy resources, including oil, iron, and steel. Russia had excelled in machinery production. Russia had a vast transport sector that connected its remotest areas with efficiency. Russia had a good domestic consumer industry too, which produced everything from pins to cars, though in quality they did not match with the Western capitalist countries. They were generally inferior to what was available in the West. The next important point to note here is that the Soviet state was a welfare state. It provided a minimum standards of living for all the citizens. It provided facilities for medical care, education, and child care. Besides, it also provided social security to its citizens. Social security means state assistance in cases of unemployment, old age, and sickness. You can compare this system with the existing system in India. In India, we save money for our old age. We have to take care of ourselves. We depend upon our children. But in Soviet Russia, old age was the responsibility of state. Understood? Let us now see the other side of the coin, that means the drawbacks of the Soviet system. Students, just now we read that trade, agriculture, communication, industry, banks, means of transport, everything was under state control. Naturally, everywhere officials were involved. This made the state machinery huge. Not only huge, but also made the government officials powerful. Files moved slowly, there was delay in decision making. Corruption had also crept in. Thus, the Soviet system became very bureaucratic. Not only bureaucratic, it also became authoritarian. Just think yourself. When all activities are brought under state control, how can there be any scope of personal liberty? All people became servants of the state. There was no free will. They did not allow freedom of speech to people. That means people got equality, but they had to pay a price. They got equality at the cost of liberty. The Communist Party had tight control over all institutions, and they were also not accountable to the people. The party refused to recognize the urge of people in different republics to manage their own affairs, including their cultural affairs. There was in reality dictatorship of the party. Dear students, the USSR was made of several republics, and the Republic of Russia was just one of them. But in reality, Russia dominated everything, and people from other regions felt neglected and often suppressed. The constitution had introduced a federal system of government in the country, but the same constitution gave so much powers to the federal government that it assumed the character of a unitary state. The federal government enjoyed almost a dictatorial position against the republics whose powers were very insignificant. They did not enjoy the powers which the states of other federal countries enjoyed. During the Cold War, just recall, we had seen that USSR had got engaged in the arms race with the US. But then she was paying a high price for it. This had drained much of her resources. Another drain on the Soviet economy was the Soviet invasion and long occupation of Afghanistan. Soviet troops entered Afghanistan in December 1979 and remained there until February 1989. Huge expenditure was incurred in the Afghan war. It is estimated that Soviets spent around 50 billion US dollars in Afghanistan. This was an added burden to its already faltering economy. The Soviet economy failed to sustain the growth rate that it had achieved during the period of Stalin. This economic downturn had dire impacts on living standards. Soviet citizens had never enjoyed standards of living comparable to the West. They never enjoyed the infrastructure, amenities, and services that were available to the people in the Western world. With German cars, French perfumes, Italian wines, and British made appliances, West Europeans were living good life compared to the Soviet counterparts, who had become used to long queues for their daily needs. This was so because the Soviet economy had always prioritized military and industrial requirements over everyday consumer goods. As a consequence, there were dire shortages for even the most basic items. Long queues of people for bread, empty shelves in grocery stores became a familiar sight. Whereas in advanced capitalist societies, goods chased people, in the Soviet Union, people chased goods. By the 1980s, Soviet Russia could not produce enough grain to feed its own population. She relied on food grain imports, including large amounts from Western countries. This was a very embarrassing situation. Food grain imports increased everywhere. The Soviet economy that started to falter in the late 1970s finally became stagnant. This was all about the Soviet system. Let us now see Gorbachev and the disintegration. Mikhail Gorbachev was elected the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Soviet Union in 1985. Gorbachev was an open and reform-minded person. Although a communist, he believed that certain reforms were necessary for survival. He wanted to democratize and reform the Soviet Union. He also wanted to normalize relations with the West. Externally, as soon as Gorbachev became reluctant to enforce the earlier policy of intervention in the internal affairs of its East European allies, the political changes in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany gathered momentum. People of these countries began to protest against their governments and the Soviet control. This time, USSR under Gorbachev did not intervene. Gorbachev refused to use force and allowed people to choose their own governments and ways of life. Eventually, starting with Poland, countries began to break away from Soviet blocs. Now let us see what happened within the USSR. Gorbachev introduced his reforms through the policy of glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost, my dear students, means openness. Through glasnost, he allowed the people freedom of speech. It allowed people to criticize the state, something that was previously unthinkable. He allowed them freedom of information. People were given the right to get full and correct information about public issues. He aimed to end censorship by giving more freedom to media. Newspapers could criticize the government. He also cleared way for multi-party system in the Soviet Union. That means parties other than the communist parties could participate in the elections. Perestroika means restructuring. With perestroika, he decentralized decision making to improve the economy. It was a state program to open up the economy and put it at par with the capitalist West. Through perestroika, he was trying to bring a hybrid communist capitalist system where the state would still control the directions of the economy while allowing market forces to dictate some production and development decisions. Thus, through his reforms, he wanted to make the Soviet Union more democratic and revive economy. So these policies modernized Soviet Union, but they also pushed non-Russian nationalists for independence. It caused separatist movements among the non-Russian republics to grow. In March 1990, Lithuania declared its independence and became the first republic to part ways with USSR. Then the agitation also spread to Estonia and Latvia. In June 1990, Russian parliament also declared its sovereignty and the intention to establish a democratic state within a liberalized Soviet Union. Now, the economic and political reforms initiated by Gorbachev within the country was not being liked by the leaders of the Communist Party itself. The reforms were opposed by them. Thereafter, the party hardliners staged a coup in 1991 attempting to remove Gorbachev from power. Gorbachev was placed under house arrest and was pressurized to resign, which he refused to do. At this time, Boris Yeltsin made his entry. He had just won the election of the Russian Republic. Yeltsin, along with his supporters, stepped in against the coup. He called on the people of Russia to strike and protest the coup. People who were living under the authoritative regimes right from the period of Stalin had got the taste of freedom. They did not want to see those days again. They demonstrated their dislike for the rigidities of the communist system. So, they did not go along with the rebels. Tanks appeared on the streets of Moscow. Soldiers tried to arrest Yeltsin, but people blocked their way to the parliament building. When thousands of people took to the streets and demonstrated, the coup collapsed in 2 days. Gorbachev was released. Yeltsin emerged as a national hero. But as a result of this turmoil, the government in Moscow lost its influence, and many other republics proclaimed independence in the following days and months. The secession of the Baltic states was recognized in September 1991. In December 1991, under the leadership of Yeltsin, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus annulled the 1922 Treaty of the Creation of USSR and declared that the Soviet Union was disbanded. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union was banned. Capitalism and democracy were adopted as the basis for the post-Soviet republics. These three states also recognized each other's independence and created the Commonwealth of Independent States to replace the Soviet Union. With the exception of the Baltic states, all the former Soviet republics joined the Commonwealth of Independent States. So now, when Soviet Union ceased to exist, Gorbachev resigned as the president of the Soviet Union on the day of Christmas 1991. Now the next issue was the question of succession of USSR. Russia was accepted as the successor state to the USSR. Russia accepted all the international treaties and commitments of the USSR. That meant Russia took the responsibility for everything that the Soviet Union did, from weapon control and disposal to the international debts. Russia inherited the Soviet seat in the United Nations Security Council. Let us now quickly glance at the reasons of Soviet disintegration and its consequences. Students, no single reason can be attributed as the cause of disintegration. Let us discuss them one by one. First, economic failures. There is no doubt that there were internal weaknesses of the economic institutions. Students, there was an emphasis on the heavy industries, as a result of which the Soviet economy failed to meet the expectations of the people, especially in terms of food and consumer goods. The management and control of agriculture and industry was in the hands of state officials. People's standard of living was far below the standard of living of people of the advanced countries in the West. Next, militarization. To make herself militarily strong and to compete with the US, the Soviet Union spent a large portion of its resources in the manufacture of weapons. Initially, only the United States possessed the atomic weapons, but in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded the atom bomb and thus began the arms race. Thus, in order to match the military might of the US, Soviet economy was consuming much of its resources in maintaining a nuclear and military arsenal. Besides, Soviet Union was also bearing the cost of development and maintenance of its satellite states in the East European countries. Soviet leaders forgot that they did not have so much resources as US and other Western nations possessed. This led to a huge economic burden that the system could not cope with. So, because of the militarization, shortages occurred in respect of basic necessities like tea, butter, meat, shoes, toothpaste, clothes, etc. Next, comparison of Soviet Union with Western nations. With the growth of information technology and means of communication, people gained access to all information about the Western nations. They became aware of the economic advancement of the West. They could see the disparities between their system and the systems of the West. They found out what grand facilities in respect of housing, schools, arts and entertainment were available to the people in Western countries. When they compared their political and economic system with the Western nations, they got shocked because they had grown up listening that the Soviet system was better than the Western capitalism. Understood? Next, political and administrative stagnation. The Soviet Union had become stagnant in the administrative and political sense as well. The Communist Party that had ruled the Soviet Union for over 70 years had turned authoritarian and was not accountable to the people. Party bureaucrats gained more privileges than ordinary people. There was widespread corruption and lack of transparency. People did not have the freedom of speech. Political activities were not tolerated. They were afraid of the secret police. They could not protest. Then who would change the system? They lost their hopes. As a result, people identified themselves neither with the system nor with the rulers, and so the government lost popular support. Next, role of Gorbachev. This is very important. Dear students, there were problems in Soviet Union. Gorbachev diagnosed the problem correctly and tried to rectify them through his reforms. But when Gorbachev carried out his reforms, he unleashed such forces that were virtually impossible to control, and that ultimately led to the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Dear students, a sort of an unholy alliance existed between the incapable, corrupt officials and incompetent people working in factories. And these people wanted to continue their activities in the way they were doing them before. So when Gorbachev launched his programs, the corrupt officials opposed it. There was also a section of bureaucrats and communist hardliners who did not want to adopt these policies. They felt that their power, privileges, and luxury would reduce if restructuring and openness were brought into the system. On the other hand, there were common people who were becoming impatient for the openness and the restructuring of system. They wanted these reforms to be implemented faster than it was scheduled to be. They wanted to catch up with the West quickly. So they became disappointed when they felt that they were not benefiting from the reforms as they had hoped. Gorbachev was thus caught between two groups demanding different types of action. One section of the society did not want the reforms and the other wanted it to move fast. In this tug of war of divided opinion, Gorbachev lost support on all sides. Understood? Next, rise of nationalism among various republics. Dear students, we have read that the satellite states in Eastern Europe based on Soviet model were all overthrown by popular revolutions. This opened a Pandora box of nationalistic expectations within the Soviet Union itself. The rise of nationalism and the desire for sovereignty in Baltic republics, Ukraine, Georgia, including Russia, proved to be the final and most immediate cause for the disintegration of the USSR. See, the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia had been independent states between the two world wars and were annexed by the USSR in June 1940. These states had always maintained their stand that they were forcibly annexed and hence their annexation into the Soviet Union was illegal. They believed that the merger was the result of some secret pact between Stalin and Hitler. They had also perceived themselves to be more a part of Europe than of Russia. So nationalist sentiments were there. Gorbachev's reforms just acted as a catalyst. It speeded up and increased nationalist dissatisfaction to the point that the governments and rulers could not control it. Next, desire to get rid of backward Central Asian states. Dear students, during the Cold War, it was thought that given the ethnic and religious differences in the Central Asian republics with the Soviet Union and their economic backwardness, nationalist unrest would be more there. But what actually came out was different. Nationalist dissatisfaction with the Soviet Union was found to be more in European and prosperous part, in Baltic states as well as in Ukraine and Georgia. Ordinary people among these prosperous republics did not want to pay the price to uplift the backward Central Asian republics. Understood? Let us now see the consequences of disintegration of the USSR. The collapse of the Soviet Union and the socialist systems in the Eastern Europe had profound consequences for world politics. We will put them mainly under three heads. First of all, it meant the end of Cold War confrontations. The disintegration of USSR students meant the fall of the Second World. It also meant the end of the ideological conflict. The dispute over whether the capitalist system was better or the communist system was better and which system would dominate the world was not an issue anymore. Since the Cold War had also led to the arms race between the superpowers, the end of Cold War had also led to the end of arms race. People could expect peace in the world. Secondly, disintegration of the USSR also changed the power relations in world politics. It resulted a change in the balance of power. The end of the Cold War paved possibility of dominance either by the only left superpower America or by a group of countries where no power will dominate. That means the bipolarity was to be replaced by either a unipolar world or a multipolar world. As the events turned out, finally the US became the sole superpower. There was no power left to challenge the supremacy of the US acquired an effective role in commanding and controlling the world politics. Financial institutions like the World Bank, IMF, or even the WTO are being used by the USA and other developed countries to implement policies to suit their interests. Their decisions have increased the miseries of the weak and poor nations. Even the UNO and the Security Council have come under the sway of the USA. The capitalist economy is now the dominant economic system, and the liberal democracy has emerged as the dominant political system internationally. Third, the emergence of many new countries. The republics that separated from the Soviet Union became the members of the United Nations. This naturally led to an increase in the number of members of this world body. All these countries had their own independent aspirations and choices. Some of them, especially the Baltic and East European states, wanted to join the European Union and become a part of the NATO. For example, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland have all joined European Union. The Central Asian countries wanted to take advantage of their geographical location and continue their ties with Russia and also establish ties with the West, the US, the China and others. These are in general the consequence of the disintegration of the USSR. Let us now quickly revise shock therapy in post-communist regimes and its consequences. Shock therapy means treating a patient by administering some shock or blow. Shock therapy, dear students, referred to here is an economic theory that says that sudden dramatic changes in national economic policy can turn a state-controlled economy into a free market economy. So, shock therapy is a group of policies that is meant to liberalize an economy. Shock therapy generally includes ending price controls, stopping government subsidies, privatizing state-owned industries, and tighter fiscal policies such as higher rate taxes and lowered government spending. It also includes trade liberalization. But then, what is the objective of doing all these? The objective of shock therapy is to cure economic maladies like hyperinflation, shortages, to boost economic production, reduce unemployment, and improve living standards. I hope you have understood what is shock therapy and what treatment it does. Now, what we have read so far is that of all East European countries that were part of Soviet bloc had become free from Soviet control. Thereafter, Soviet Union also disintegrated. The former Soviet republics, including Russia, also became independent states. Communism collapsed. Capitalism was adopted in these states. Each of these countries was required to make a total shift to a capitalist economy. So, was this transition to a totally opposite system going to be so easy? No, not at all. This was going to be full of problems and challenges. It was going to be painful because of shock therapy. It was difficult for the newly independent countries to suddenly embrace these changes. After the end of the communist rule, something like this happened in Russia. An effort was made to establish a new order in place of the then existing political economic system. Till the other day, there was communist dictatorship in Russia, but now democratic institutions were to be set up. So far, agriculture and industries was under state control, but now they were to be owned by private individuals. The task of transforming collective farms into private farms and bring state industry under private sector was not easy. Historically, Soviet Union had pursued the policy of self-sufficiency. She traded very little. Her foreign trade played a minor role in the economy. Bulk of her economic activities was conducted with communist countries only, particularly those of Eastern Europe. Therefore, switching to free trade was considered essential. Shock therapy, dear students, involved development of free trade and allowing foreign investment, deregulation and currency convertibility. Allowing foreign investment meant foreign companies could invest in the host country now. The advantage of foreign investment is that it brings not only money but also new technologies. Deregulation meant removal or reduction of government regulations in industries. That meant allowing industries to take their own decisions and operate business freely. Understood? Now, as this transition occurred, there was a change in the nature and direction of trade alliances among the countries of Soviet bloc also. Existing trade alliances among the Soviet bloc countries were dismantled. Each state from the bloc was now linked directly to the West and not to each other in the region. They were going to be the part of Western economic system. The Western capitalist states now became the leaders and thus guided and controlled the development of the region through various agencies and organizations, particularly IMF. The IMF played a key role in helping the countries of the former Soviet bloc transition from central planning to market-driven economy. Understood? Let us now see the consequences of shock therapy. Did the shock therapy yield the desired result? No, it did not deliver what was expected. Rather, it brought ruin to the economies and disaster upon the people of the entire region. Let us divide the consequences under three heads: economic, social, and political consequences, and then read. Okay. First, economic consequences. In Russia, the large state controlled industrial complex almost collapsed. These industries were undervalued and put up for sale to private individuals and companies at throwaway prices. That is why it was called the largest garage sale in history. It is said that these industries were even given to the relatives of Boris Yeltsin at far less value than they were worth of. Although all citizens were also given vouchers to participate in the sales, but most of them sold their vouchers in black market because they needed the money. The value of ruble, the Russian currency, declined drastically. In 1992, whereas 1 US dollar was equal to 125 rubles, in 1998 its value came down to about 6,000 rubles. The rate of inflation was also very high. Inflation, dear students, occurs when there is an increase in the prices of goods and services. That means people could buy less things for 1 ruble now than what they could buy before. So they lost all of their savings. The collective farm system also collapsed. The production of food grain came down and Russia started to import food from other parts of the world. The real GDP of Russia in 1999 came down far below what it was in 1989. Let us now see the social consequences. The old system of social security was destroyed. The government withdrew the subsidies that it used to give to its people. As you know, people were entitled earlier to receive state assistances during the old age and illness. Free medical treatment was available to the poor and needy, but now this system was broken. So a large number of people went below the poverty line. As a result, the middle class suffered and was pushed to the margins. The academic and intellectual class fled away wherever they could. A mafia emerged in most of these countries and started controlling many economic activities. Privatization led to new disparities. There emerged a division between the rich and poor regions in post Soviet states, especially Russia. Unlike the earlier system, there was now great economic inequality between people. Understood? Let us now see the political consequences. Building of democratic institutions was not given adequate attention and priority as was given to economic transformation. The constitutions of all these countries were drafted in a hurry, and most of them, including Russia, had a strong executive president with the widest possible powers that made elected parliaments very weak. In Central Asia, for example, the presidents of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, the presidents had great powers, and several of them became very authoritarian. First, they appointed themselves to power for 10 years and then extended it for another 10 years. They did not allow any dissent or opposition. A judicial culture and the independence of judiciary was yet to be established in most of these countries. Dear students, the economic revival of most of these countries took some time. If you see Russia, it started reviving in 2000, some 10 years after their independence. The reason for the economic revival for most of these countries was the export of natural resources like oil, natural gas, and minerals. Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan are major oil and gas producers. Other countries have also gained because of the oil pipelines that cross through their territories for which they get rent. Some amount of manufacturing has also started. So this is all about shock therapy and its consequences. Let us now go to tensions and conflicts. Dear students, the area covered by the erstwhile USSR was huge in terms of not only its space but also in terms of diversity. There were ethnic and religious differences. This gave rise to conflicts from time to time as different separatist groups tried to assert their dominance in the region. So most of the former Soviet republics witnessed conflicts, civil wars, and insurgencies. Insurgency means an uprising or rebellion by some group against the government. Let us divide the topic in three parts: 1. Within Russia, 2. In Central Asia, and 3. Eastern Europe. So first, Russia. In Russia, two republics, Chechnya and Dagestan, had violent secessionist movements. After the collapse of Soviet Union, Chechnya declared herself independent. Actually, separatist warlords were already leading armed operations in this region for a long time. This was not something new. Stalin and Khrushchev also had to struggle hard to suppress them. In 1994, Russia sent troops to quash the independence movement. But the Russian forces had to suffer severe reverses due to guerrilla activities of the Chechen rebels. Thereafter, Russia had to resort to heavy bombing of guerrilla controlled areas that had raised the issue of human rights violation. At present, Putin has somehow been able to manage peace in this region. Let us see the Central Asia now. First, Tajikistan. After the collapse of Soviet Union, Tajikistan declared its independence in September 1991. Thereafter, a civil war broke out between various factions in May 1992. This went on for 10 years till 2001. Next, Azerbaijan. In Azerbaijan's province of Nagorno-Karabakh, some local Armenians want to secede and join Armenia. Nagorno-Karabakh is a region in the southwestern Azerbaijan. Look at the map. The region was acquired by Russia in 1813 and in 1923 the Soviet government established it as an American majority autonomous region of the Azerbaijan SSR. So Nagorno-Karabakh is a part of Azerbaijan but its population is majority Armenians and this arrangement made Nagorno-Karabakh a minority enclave within Azerbaijan. After decades of Soviet rule, in 1988, the Armenians of the Nagorno-Karabakh region began agitating for the transfer of this region under Armenia. But this was strongly opposed by the Soviet government as well as Azerbaijan SSR. When Soviet Union collapsed in 1991 and Armenians and Azerbaijan declared their independence, Armenians and Azerbaijanis went into war. The separatist ethnic Armenians here get support from Armenian government. Next, Georgia. In Georgia, there was demand for independence from two provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, and that resulted in a civil war from 1991 to 1993. Besides, a coup was also attempted against the first democratically elected president of Georgia. There were movements against the existing regimes in Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan also. My dear students, the Central Asian republics are areas with vast hydrocarbon resources also, which have brought them economic benefit. Hydrocarbon resources means coal, petroleum and natural gas. As you know, these are the main energy sources of the world. That is why this region has attracted oil companies and major world powers. See the location of this region. It is close to West Asia and next to Russia, China, Afghanistan and Pakistan. After 9/11, the US wanted military bases in this region and paid the government of all Central Asian states to hire bases and to allow airplanes to fly over their territory during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. However, Russia perceives these states as its near abroad and believes that they should be under Russian influence. China has also shown interests here because of the oil resources and has begun to settle around the borders and conduct trade. Let us now see what happened in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, we find two cases of split of Czechoslovakia and split of Yugoslavia. My dear students, Czechoslovakia was officially created as an independent state after the collapse of Austria-Hungary at the end of First World War on 28th of October 1918. Thereafter, it became a satellite state of Soviet Union in 1948. On 1st January 1993, it split into two separate successor states, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic. The good thing in this split was that it was peaceful, it had no violence. But the most severe conflict took place in the Balkan republics of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was also created at the end of First World War when Croats, Slovenian and Bosnian territories that had been the part of Austro-Hungary Empire united with the Serbian kingdom. Though it was a communist state, but it broke away from the Soviet sphere of influence in 1948. If you can recall, Yugoslavia was the founding member of the non-aligned movement in 1961. Josip Broz Tito was the leader. Though there were cultural and religious divisions between the ethnic groups there, but there were some external factors also that finally led to its breakup. After 1991, it broke apart with several provinces like Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina declaring independence. Ethnic Serbs opposed this and a massacre of non-Serb Bosnians followed. The NATO intervention and the bombing of Yugoslavia followed the inter-ethnic civil war. Let us now look how good are India's relationships with the post-communist countries. India has maintained good relations with all the post-communist countries, but relations between Russia and India are the strongest. India's relations with Russia are an important aspect of India's foreign policy. Russia and India share a vision of a multipolar world order. What does this mean? This means the coexistence of several powers in the international system, collective security. This means greater regionalism. This means settlement of international conflicts through negotiations and not by force. This also means an independent foreign policy for all sovereign countries and decision making through bodies like the United Nations. Dear students, Indo Russian friendship is a time tested relationship. No one has been such a trusted friend as Russia has been to us. Undoubtedly, there has been some hiccups after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Yet, both of them have nurtured strong bond over the years. There have been close cultural relations between India and Russia. Indian heroes from Raj Kapoor to Amitabh Bachchan were very popular names in the Soviet Union. They were in fact household names in Russia as well as many post-Soviet countries. One can hear Hindi film songs all over the region. Look at this report. This is a report by the BBC's Central Asia correspondent Louis Hidalgo in 1998. He says that there has been great love for Indian movies in Uzbekistan. When Moscow ruled in Uzbekistan, Indian films were dubbed in Russian and shown there. A whole generation of Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Kazakhs have been brought up knowing our actors like Raj Kapoor. He further says, 7 years after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Uzbek passion for Indian films continued. Within months of the release of a new film in India, pirate copies are already on sale in Uzbek capital Tashkent. This is given in your textbook, you can read it later on. Let us see military relations. The partnership between the two countries developed particularly after the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation that we read in the Cold War lesson. Russia in fact stands to benefit from this relationship because India is the second largest arms market for Russia. The Indian military gets most of its hardware from Russia. Majority of the Indian defense equipment is currently of Russian make. The most recent purchase from Russia is the S-400 air defense missile system. A deal is already signed with Russia for nuclear-powered attack submarine, the delivery of which is getting delayed, may be due to ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. BrahMos, the fastest supersonic cruise missile in the world, has been developed as a joint venture between India and Russia. Sukhoi Su-30 MKI Russian fighter aircraft is being built under license by Hindustan Aeronautics Limited for the Air Force. Since 2003, India and Russia are conducting a joint naval exercise called Indra biennially. Let us see economic relations now. When India decided to set up heavy industry, it was Soviet Union who helped us. Russia supplied us capital as well as technical know-how in setting up steel plants at Bhilai, Bokaro and heavy engineering corporation in Ranchi. Since India is an oil importing nation, Russia is important to India and has repeatedly come to the assistance of India during its oil crisis. Trade between India and Russia also flourished with the passage of time. India is seeking to increase its energy imports from Russia and the republics of Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Cooperation with these republics includes partnership and investment in oil fields. Let us see political relationships. If you see the relationship in present Russian-Ukraine war context, where the West is bringing UN resolutions against Russia, India is abstaining. But there was a time when India used to be at the receiving end of the Western resolutions at the UN, then it was always the Soviet Union that used its veto power to save India. Whether it was Kashmir issue in 1957, over Goa issue in 1961, over Kashmir issue again in 1962 and over Bangladesh liberation in 1971. Recently, when the UN Security Council was discussing India's move after abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, Russia backed us again. On India's claim for permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council, Russia has supported our claim again. So here, India seems to get benefited from its relationship with the Soviet Union on international issues. Let us see science and technology. Russia is important for India's nuclear energy plans. India's nuclear power plant in Kudankulam, Tamil Nadu was built in collaboration with Russia. See our achievements in space. India was able to launch its first two artificial satellites, Aryabhat and Bhaskar, in 1975 and 1979, respectively, from the USSR. Do you know? In 1984, squadron leader Rakesh Sharma was the first Indian to fly to space. This became possible only because of USSR. Russia has also assisted India's space industry, for example, by giving the cryogenic engine when India needed it. Russia and India have collaborated on various scientific projects. At present, Russia is collaborating with India in Mission Gaganyaan. Gaganyaan is India's first human space flight program. I hope you must have understood this relationship. Dear students, that is all in this lesson. If you think that you have benefited from this class, then please like, share and subscribe to it. In the next class, we shall learn the next lesson, US hegemony in the world politics. Thank you.